I know not everyone has been able to join all week. Should we go around and do some quick introductions? I can start. My name is Brittany Manzo. My pronouns are she and her, and I am facilitating the Emergency Homelessness Task Force and supporting the City of Bend and Deschutes County and the City of Redmond and all of their community partners in developing a strategic plan. So that's my role here today. I'm based in Seattle, Washington. And it's so great to be here with you. And do we have any volunteers for who to go next? We can kind of popcorn around quick. Thanks, Zav.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Xavier Borja. I use he, him, él pronouns. I usually just go by Xavi, and I'm the community relations manager, I think coming on like 2 months now, maybe. But I lived in Bend for like 11 years now. And yeah, and my position is with an emphasis on equity and partnerships. And let's go ahead and popcorn to Morgan.
Hi, friends. My name is Morgan Schmidt. Serving for a couple more months as one of the pastors at First Presbyterian, but I also run Pandemic Partners, and I'm the chair of the Community Engagement Committee for the Homeless Leadership Coalition. So thanks for having us. We're popcorning. Ashley, because you're on the committee.
Thanks, Morgan. I'm Ashley Dowden. I have lived in Bend for just over 2 years. My family has lived here for over a decade. Personally, I moved here straight from New York City, and it's harder to live here. So, and I have a master's degree, and I'm incredibly employable, but not here. So I have a passion lit now to help make this a livable place for everybody. I'm on the community engagement committee. I know Morgan through church, through doing shelters. I'm here because I want to live here and I want to see this place work for people. And I also want to see us educate our neighbors. What they think they already know, they don't. So I'm excited to be here, and I'm working on a proposal for the Community Engagement Committee with Mandy and some others to put out a framework for our HLC network and wider networks to have a campaign strategy. So we don't have to worry about being responsive or reactive. Instead, we're just constantly educating and storytelling. And that's something I'm working on getting in a proposal shape for Mandy to present soon. So that's me. And I'll popcorn to Elaine.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Knob-Schultz, pronouns she, her, hers. I'm with Mosaic Medical. I'm the Director of Strategy and Development, and I'm on the task force. And this was actually the only meeting I could fit in my schedule a week, but I thought it was a perfect one because I'm basically the leader for community engagement at Mosaic, and I have the communications team that reports to me, and I'm passionate about making sure we're doing education to welcome everyone in our community with supports and resources. So glad to be here. And I will go to Megan, Councillor Perkins.
Good morning, everyone. Megan Perkins. I'm Bend City Councillor, and more importantly, am the liaison to this awesome task force and the person that regularly gets up on my soapbox at every council meeting to remind people that we should stop dehumanizing our neighbors. And I use she, her pronouns, and I will pass it along to Molly.
Morning, everyone. I'm Molly Wills-Darling. I am a program manager with Deschutes County Behavioral Health, and one of my teams is our homeless outreach team. And I will pass it to Stacy.
Good morning. My apologies for being late. My name is Stacy Whitty, and I use pronouns she, her, hers. And I am the executive director of REACH, and we provide mobile case management and outreach, and we run our safe car parking. I think the question was, why am I here? I am here because I believe that everyone has the right to be treated and live their lives with dignity and worth. And my hope is that these valuable conversations will be able to take them into an action plan and move these thoughts forward into our community so that we can move forward as a wonderful city together, not a us and them type of environment. So thank you for having me, and I'm honored to be with you all. And I'm sorry, I don't know who hasn't gone because I joined late. So maybe if someone Is there anyone else that hasn't gone?
Go
I'll
Stacey.
jump in. Oh, there we go.
Oh.
Go
Thanks,
ahead,
Tara.
Joshua.
My name is Joshua Romero. I'm our Assistant Communications Director here at the City of Bend. And as Mickey alluded to, in past positions, I've kind of worked in community relations. So like a different version of the job Zavi now has. And so I'm here to kind of be a resource, help just reflect some of these ideas and contribute to the conversation as well. All right, Tara, it's all you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Tara Furtado, Program Manager, Bethlehem and Bend and Redmond, a task force participant and chair for the Regional Shelter Committee under HLC. So good morning, everybody.
Thanks, Tara.
I can go. I'm Colleen Thomas. I use the pronoun she, her, hers. Currently I'm wearing two hats, I think, in this meeting. One, I am the Homeless Services Coordinator for Deschutes County Health Services. I also chair our local Continuum of Care, the Homeless Leadership Coalition, which really focuses on Crook, Deschutes, Jefferson counties and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. So kind of bringing that regional perspective as we have this conversation today. And yeah, I am really excited about today's session. I've been able to attend all of them with the exception of one this week. And many times throughout this week, I said, oh no, this will be the community engagement conversation. So excited to hear from all of you and continue to be able to do this work to bring voice and empower those that may not feel like they have a voice in our community. Allison, I don't think you've gone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Hi, my name is Allison Platt. I go by she, her pronouns. I work for the City of Bend, obviously, with fun background. And I've kind of transitioned roles. So I used to be a senior planner in our growth management or kind of long range planning group, but recently transitioned into our urban renewal group. And I am the core area project manager. So we have a new urban renewal district kind of within the center of the city. If you're familiar with kind of the Bend Central District, that is within the core area. And so kind of have a multifaceted role now where I oversee our urban renewal program for that area, but I'm also kind of a liaison to all the businesses within that area that have been really struggling with houselessness, especially along that 2nd Street corridor. And so have been fielding a lot of phone calls, especially in the last few weeks as that camp has been growing. And so trying to kind of be part of the solution. Obviously, there's a lot of opportunity to increase housing options within the Bend Central District. And I coordinate with a lot of future developers within that area that are considering housing development. And then I'm also kind of co-leading a project with Lynn McConnell to look at tax exemption programs that could benefit both like very low income housing options. We just presented to council last night on pursuing some of those exemption programs and did get direction to continue to pursue them. So kind of hoping to be part of the solution for just increasing housing options in a variety of ways. So kind of wanted to join today. I have to jump off kind of on and off for some meetings, but I'm glad I was able to make it for intros. And it's fun I worked with Stacy and Colleen when the pandemic first hit on some food coordination to get food delivered. So I haven't actually seen either of you ever. I've just talked to you on the phone. So it's kind of nice to see your face. So nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Allison. Mickey?
So Mickey Dirting, I'm the Strategic Initiatives Manager at the City of Bend, and I'm also the Emergency Homelessness Task Force Liaison and supporting everybody on that task force and the city staff with moving the ball forward, whether that's the strategic plan, if it's the, helping to design the joint office structure, working on the visual narrative for our houselessness crisis in our region. So anything to help support all of you all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mickey. And thank you everyone for making the time today. I'm so glad you're all here. So this is, as folks have alluded to, this is our 5th of 5 action planning meetings. So our last one for the week. And to Colleen's point, there have been a lot of ideas that have come up throughout our other 4 action planning meetings to inform today's conversation. So I know we're all super excited to get into it. I do want to take a moment, since we do have some folks who haven't been a part of the task force. I want to take a minute to just share our process and where we are with the strategic plan. So the task force was stood up in June. I was brought in July. Since then, we've been working on a gaps analysis to understand what resources the community has and what resources the community needs to expand and make comprehensive the services and supports for people experiencing homelessness in Deschutes County. Hey, Eliza, we are just getting started. I'm so glad you're here. I will give you a minute. Once I'm done, I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself, but I don't want to put you right on the spot. So glad you're here. So we worked on a gaps analysis and started shaping our strategies and getting a deeper understanding of our overall vision. What is our North Star for this work? So at our November 30th meeting, we shared a draft of the strategic plan, which I can walk you guys through at a high level. And this is what our action planning meetings have been around. So the strategic plan, can everyone see my screen? Great. So the strategic plan, the structure is under a 10-year vision. And what you see on your screen right now is our 10-year vision. Beneath that, we have 5-year milestones that will be kind of the measurable goals that we want to check and make sure that we are hitting in 2027 to make sure that we are well on our way to reaching this vision in 2032. And then the strategic plan itself, the strategies and actions inside it, those are boxed into a 3-year plan. So what we're really trying to do is give ourselves space to revisit the strategies and the priorities to keep ourselves on track toward the milestones and toward this broader vision. So our vision is that in 2032, and I love this vision. I love that the task force signed on to it. It was like the best day of 2021 for me, completely unexpectedly. Folks loved this. So I just have to gush about it every time I introduce it, because it's really the best of the community's vision for the future. So in 2032, housing instability in all forms is rare, brief, and non-recurring in Deschutes County. The community uses its strengths and resources to ensure that anyone who is unsafe, experiencing an urgent health crisis, and facing housing instability of any kind is able to access the support they need to regain safety and stability, recover, and thrive. The region's growth and wealth are reflected in the quality of life and safety of all residents of Deschutes County. That is exactly how I feel about this vision. A little fist pumping. I'm a Jersey girl, so always fist. I think that was fist pumping, right? Okay, good. Exactly. Yes, that is the kind of celebrating I was doing that day when I realized that folks are ready to put what it takes to get to this vision and to commit to it. So to get there in 2032, our 5-year milestones, we carved out 4 specific milestones that we want to be at in 2027. We know this work will not be done overnight. So we want to be clear about what we think we can do in the next 5 years, to be clear about what we need to do in the next 3 years. So in 5 years, young people and elderly adults experiencing housing instability will have immediate connections to shelter, support, and services that they need. 150 people experiencing chronic homelessness will be housed and receiving ongoing supportive services based on their needs. And all individuals and families at immediate risk of experiencing homelessness are able to access resources and supports to help them address the crises at hand as needed to prevent them from experiencing homelessness. So that's really focusing on prevention and diversion resources. Services are available to support every person experiencing homelessness in connecting to healthcare, addressing their basic needs in a dignifying manner, navigating crises, and re-engaging in the workforce if they're not already and desire to do so. So those are our 5-year milestones. And in order for us to get there, sorry, I'm going to breeze through some of these, I guess faster than I meant to. To get there, we carved out 5 strategies for the next 3 years that'll take priority for the community to implement. So I'm actually going to move us over to our Miro board. And if you want to get on the Miro board, Mickey can send you a link, but I think over the course of the week, I have finally maybe gotten good at zooming in enough so that folks can read the screen, but it's entirely possible that that's not true too. So let me share this.
While you're waiting for that, if you're seeing somebody on the what do you call it, the attendees list that you think I should move to panelists, please let me know.
Sure. Thanks, Mickey. And so these the 5 strategies, which I'm not going to talk through in depth, but for the purpose of our community engagement and public education conversation today, I want to make sure that you all have a sense of where we're going. The 5 strategies, the 5 other strategies or 4 other strategies beyond community engagement that we met to do action planning around earlier this week are addressing unsheltered homelessness, expanding services, prioritizing the community's 10-year vision into all affordable housing planning, establishing a joint office to drive community-wide strategies and lead implementation of the strategic plan, and support and lead public-private partnerships and community engagement, which is, of course, what we're here to talk about today. I will pause and give us time. Eliza, I'll give you time to introduce yourself. And then I do want to open it up to make sure that folks who haven't been as plugged into the task force have a chance to ask questions before we get into our specific action planning today. But Eliza, did you want to introduce yourself? We did pronouns, who you are, what you're doing here. The cliff notes to everyone else is that we're all really excited to be here. I think.
Awesome. Yeah.
To summarize.
Eliza Wilson, she, her, hers. I'm from JBRJ Youth Services and I'm the program director, for JBRJ Youth Services, overseeing homeless youth services and just like community engagement. I'm also coordinated entry chair for our region and sit on the Homeless Leadership Coalition. Did I miss any of the questions? Was that all of it?
I don't think so. I think you got it. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So looking at the vision, the milestones, the strategies, do folks have any questions before we dig specifically into what it's going to take to implement these community engagement and public education strategies?
I have a question. If community engagement, public-private partnerships has come up in your other meetings, and if you're going to share anything else so that you may have parking lotted for this group.
Yeah, it has come up in, I think I can say, every single one of the other conversations, maybe not the joint office, though it was implicit there. So, but it did come up. And I think Colleen has been a part of many of the conversations. Councillor Perkins, Mickey, Molly, Tara, please jump in. I will do my best to summarize, but if there are points you want to make sure we're lifting up from those conversations, I will turn to you next. From my vantage point in the other conversations, what we've identified is the degree to which community engagement and public perception is a barrier to implementing these strategies. I don't know that those conversations got particularly deep into how to move public will and public perception. There is a clear energy behind it, which is why I'm so glad that I think this is our most highly attended meeting to get our best ideas on this strategy. But when it comes to obviously citing a authorized and legal space for folks to camp, when it comes to identifying space for new shelters, there is a lot of public feedback that is both around safety concerns that are reasonable and understandable and clear. And there are also some disturbing prejudices around people experiencing homelessness, what they're struggling with and why. And so we want to be able to hold both of those things while also being clear that we're going to need to see the tide turn in how the community talks about homelessness and what's required to improve the quality of life for all folks living in Central Oregon. So that's kind of at a high level. What I'm taking away from the other conversations is that public education and something I want to, sorry, I interrupt myself all the time because usually I come up with a more important thought when I was just going to repeat something I already said. At our November 30th task force meeting, I was surprised by this, but also encouraged. This is one of the top strategies for task force members. When we talked about what's most important, when we talked about what are the most impactful things we could be taking on, this was where people saw a desperate need for us to make some really significant change in the short term in order for us to get anywhere else. And so I want to lift that up too, that it's come up this week, it's come up in the task force. And I'm just so glad that we're at this point of really what I would love for today's conversation to be is to find space to get into the specifics of what actions will be required, what partnerships can be leveraged in order to put a plan together, and to build on the work that the HLC is doing as well. We don't want to duplicate work here. We want to make sure that we're complementing and maximizing best we can as we think about community engagement and public education, which are kind of two different frames for us to be working within today. Public education being the public information, information sharing, kind of changing hearts and minds and perceptions, narrative change around houselessness and homelessness, and community engagement more broadly than public education is how partners need to hold partnerships. Sorry, that's a lot of words that are the same. How the joint office and other public partners can support and hold partnerships with other members of the community. Allison, I know you have your hand up. Did you have, do you want to jump in? You're on mute.
Shoot, thanks. I've been engaging with a lot of folks on this topic that probably come from the perspective that I think we're trying to shift. And I have a lot of ideas, and I don't know if this is like the best time to kind of bring those up, but I do think that there is concern about like, you know, where are tax dollars being spent, and like then where are nonprofit resources? And I think there's just a lot of, you know, not clear certainty on who to support, because at least some of the businesses that I've been working with, you know, they're losing pretty significant sources of revenue, or, you know, they're dealing with a lot. And I think that they would love to be able to direct energy or resources to somewhere. And so there's not really like a great place to send them to of like, this is where you can donate to help this issue. And then there's just like a lack of concern about how is money being spent on this issue, because especially when it's public dollars, and how, like, where did they go to complain about it, like whatever issue it is. And so I think more information that we can provide about like what services is Deschutes County responsible for, what services are nonprofits taking over. And maybe that's something that we all just need to work on, like what are our operating procedures, but I think that information is really helpful. And yeah, that's kind of just some original thoughts that I have now, but I'm happy to help kind of support some of that messaging in any way. And I have more ideas, but just kind of wanted to bring that up as original thoughts.
No, I was muted. I was saying, go right ahead. I saw your hand up.
Oh, hi. Ashley again. I didn't say my pronouns, so she, her. I just wanted to jump in and reiterate, because I just got an email from Mandy Seeley, who's on the HLC board and on the CEC committee, that we're going to have a meeting on the 23rd with Morgan, you're on it as well, with the Health Council, the COIC, and Morgan, jump in. And what's the third body that I'm forgetting?
Yeah, you're right. COIC and the Health Council.
And HLC is the third. Okay. Yeah. To make sure that we aren't duplicating efforts. And I want to repeat that here, that if there's a city or county effort going on to put a campaign in place, I want to be sure we're synced in and looped up, because that's basically what that conversation is about, is what campaigns or educations, storytelling campaigns are you working on? So it's exactly what you're talking about. I just want to be real conscious of unhelpful duplicity. Like, more stories the better, but how can we be streamlining it would be awesome. So I mentioned to Morgan, and I'll mention now, I have to jump off and get a COVID test, unfortunately. Somebody penetrated our family bubble. Right. But I'll be listening as best I can while I'm in that parking lot waiting to get my test. but I want to be as helpful as possible. And I have a tremendous amount of time. I run my own business, which I had to make because no one would hire me here. So blah, blah, blah. How can we help that group of people? Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. I would love to make sure that we're synced for the 23rd, whether it would be helpful for Mickey and I to pitch in anyway for that meeting. I totally agree that I do not want to slow down any other public education efforts, but I do want to support them in getting coordinated so that we're not all, especially when it comes to public education, I think it would be more powerful if we stack on top of each other rather than trying to spread our energy across different initiatives. It's just my gut sense. I'm wondering, Mickey, if you might be able to share a bit about the visual narrative work you're working on, and then maybe we can start to talk about how to sync up these trains to be in a row and connected. Because Mickey's working on some visual narrative work connected to the strategic plan that might be helpful here. Mickey, am I totally putting you on the spot? Are you good?
Oh yeah, I'm good.
Awesome.
So a little bit about the visual narrative. So it was born out of the Emergency Homelessness Task Force. Members were like, we really need something that's easy and simple for the general public to understand in layman's term, storytelling format, and initially for elected officials, then it's turned into for the general public. And so the City of Bend is funding this project. We went through an RFP. We hired a local creative agency called Zoe. After we hired them, we found out that actually the founder has lived experience of being houseless in her youth for several years, and she's today paying it forward and helping out houseless community members as well. And including, she gave us pro bono project for this project that we're working on because they're so committed and passionate about it as well. So there's two things about this visual narrative that we're doing. The first thing is we want to humanize the houseless community members and tell their stories. And number two, we want to increase awareness about the houselessness crisis in our region, specific to our region, educate, provide that holistic perspective. Right now, everything is like siloed perspective. Depends on who you're talking to, you'll get a siloed perspective, then you kind of come up with like your own siloed solution. So we want to have this holistic perspective, unbiased information, with the hopes that we'll get everybody on the same page. And right now we've had a lot of you on this call that they've interviewed to provide your information, what kind of work you're doing, as well as connecting us with the houseless population, community members, and seeing like who would be able and willing to share their story. So far, I've heard we're going to profile 3 different, one would be like chronically homeless community members. One would be maybe a LGBTQ houseless community member. And the third would be families. And there's another one it's escaping me right now. But anyways, and then we're also trying to include as many parts of the community members to tell us their story of what kind of work are they doing? What kind of solutions are they providing to help us with this houselessness crisis? So this could be folks from the school district. It could be folks from the business community as well. And we're hoping to have this visual narrative completed by mid-January or before then. The other thing I wanted to share about this visual narrative that we're working on, it's going to be web-based because we're like, we don't want another PowerPoint, we don't want another PDF. So it's going to be web-based, and it's kind of like an editorial narrative, like think of like the Atlantic or New York Times, where you have, you could do like a quick scan through it and you'll see call outs, you'll see visuals, so that if you don't have time, you could see all these little nuggets, and then you'll be like, okay, that's kind of information I want to see, and I'll come back later. The hope is they come back, and then that people's perspective about our houselessness crisis here and the kind of perception people have would have shifted after going through this visual narrative. That's the hope.
Thanks, Mickey. Thanks. I want to pause. I saw my connection going wonky. Are you guys able to see my screen, or would it be easier for you to do Miro on your own? Okay, I'm seeing that. Okay, great. So thanks, Mickey, for that overview. That's really helpful. I'm curious, and Michaela, welcome. I know we did introductions and we went around. If you're comfortable, we'd love to hear who you are, what your pronouns are, what brought you here today. But if you need a minute before you're ready, that's okay too. I hate putting folks on the spot.
No, I definitely am fine with that. My name is Michaela Oliver. I work with the City of Bend as a community relations manager, like Zavi, but my focus is neighborhoods and civic engagement. And so I'm here today just to talk about how we're going to involve our community partners and neighborhoods in this effort. So I'm happy to do that. My pronouns are she, her, and I forget if there was anything else. Oh, what? No, I think I got it all.
Brought you here. Yeah, I think you got that in your job description. But yeah, awesome. Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks.
So we're talking through. We're kind of jumping right into it with public education, and I'm curious what other efforts are underway, being shaped. Ashley, I don't know if you want to share a bit about the HLC campaign or structure, if maybe that's not ready to be shared yet, but I'm curious what other public education initiatives we want to get on the board and mapped here so that we can start thinking about how to best coordinate and invest more energy in a coordinated public education campaign.
I can hop in, Brittany, thank you, and just say that like we're at sort of a topical content calendar planning phase right now, which we certainly as a committee, though we're small, we have enough mighty content to flush that out. There's enough content existing out there to curate and recycle a lot of storytelling, but we also want to stay current. And while I really don't like saying this because it's out of my comfort zone, like stories like mine are more common. This is gross, I hate saying this, but maybe more palatable to people who are having trouble understanding the breadth of the houseless crisis and the inventory of both jobs and homes in this area. Like I get interviewed for jobs and they want to pay me 50% less than I'm worth, quite frankly. And so then I wouldn't be able to live here. And you see this over and over and over. And so I guess a question is that I've been batting around for our topics is where can we engage the business community in efforts that are being made to address that disparity in wages versus cost of living? Because I know of a HLC CEC community member or community committee member rather, who runs a small business and he and his business partner are working really hard to get their minimum wage to $20 an hour. And they literally sell dumplings, but it's important for them to have their staff feel safe and secure and like they can live here. So stories like that might speak to people that are having problems hearing the other very basic human stories. Like, I don't know, like that. So that business element I think is important. Businesses, the Chamber of Commerce put out something on their social the other day that said a business member had to turn people away, or rather people were turning down job offers because they couldn't find anywhere to live. I've been able to find work in that I made a pet sitting business and people left and right are like, oh, our pet sitters had to leave town because they couldn't afford to live here anymore. So there's a lot of stories of that element that I think could be being told that maybe aren't. The other topics everybody's talking about already, right? Like LGBTQ youth. Yes, that needs to be stories. Like, and then the content calendar, do we want to do that in June, in Pride Month, like, or in November, in Homeless Youth Awareness Month? Like, there's conversations to be had. It obviously needs to be like a workshop table, maybe a suggested content calendar for everybody in keeping with what Mickey has working on. Like, I don't know how that's going to get launched, what channels those are going to go through, but like you said, collaboration. So I'll step back and let other people talk, but those are kind of my the basics. Oh, the other big one for me and for our committee that we talk about is handouts and what people are convinced people are getting. And so I think from a city and a county perspective, a story from the county, this could go back to the tax dollars and where are they going? Like, these are the services we offer, and this is what we require of a houseless community member to retain, maintain, and like take advantage of these quote services. It's not just some Santa Claus going around throwing out bread and wine or whatever people think. So more stories of that inside tax dollar.
Mhm. Thanks, Ashley. Eliza?
I just feel that if we are going to talk about public resources and service provision, then we need to definitely talk about how much it costs to not support people. Because I think, the focus gets kind of shifted, and I think that's intentional sometimes, about like, well, what are the houseless individuals doing to receive these things? Instead of like, if we were to just leave people and not support them, what is the impact on other, like on the hospital system, on the medical system? And then we in turn then end up paying for it in a different way. So just like the non-traditional ways that, tax dollars, where tax dollars go when we don't support our community members, and just some education around that.
Josh, and then Zavi.
Yeah, and I forgot to share my pronouns earlier, so my apologies. He, him, his.
Thank you.
So I just want to share with the group too, from the city's perspective, and it's kind of in alignment with what Mickey shared, is, we have a web page dedicated to sort of our work with serving the unhoused community and sort of solutions we're working on. I think what we're realizing about that is there are different audiences, right? So there's a community that we need to educate about this issue that we're facing as a community, and the need to come together as a community to address these concerns for our unhoused community members. And then there's the audience of like service providers. So in our case, like who could provide safe parking under our safe parking program, who could establish an emergency shelter using our emergency weather authorization. And so I think that's something to kind of keep in mind in the public education piece of it, that it's as much about the service providers as it is our general community about the issue. And then, I know HLC does some really great work with outreach to folks in the community who need to access these resources. But I think that's another opportunity I'm seeing too, is it can be a little bit challenging in the absence of like a joint office in terms of how this regional issue and information about it and accessing resources gets communicated generally. And so that's my hope for sort of some joint office support, is that it really will help to kind of streamline how we're sharing information and the consistency of information. I think that's kind of the other challenge too, when we have sort of discrete agencies or service providers or community groups working on this issue. Sometimes the consistency of the information could look different. And so then I think that just adds to some of the confusion around what we've just talked about, sort of sharing the reality of the impacts of unhoused community members in our community, whether that's fiscally, socially, et cetera. So that consistency, I guess, of information and the story that we're telling across service providers, public agencies, and those accessing resources.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Josh. That reminds me of something that came up pretty early in the task force process that might be helpful context here, or also an insight that I still see coming up, is that the community really wants to know whose responsibility is what. Is this a nonprofit's responsibility, or is this the county's responsibility? Is this the city's responsibility? And what, as a policy wonk, I find so interesting is that public resources very often fund the nonprofit work that's underway. And there's this tension of like, whose job is it to do this when it is a community-wide response? It is a publicly funded response. It is a privately funded response. It is a federally funded response. And so I think part of the visual narrative work and the public education that we can do is showing where local resources are complementing other resources, local public, local private resources, how that all comes together to be a shared response. It's true that there are a lot of different strategies, a lot of different initiatives. A lot of that is disconnected in the community, but for the most part, it's strategically connected in one way or another. Folks are trying to fill the gaps that exist and trying to figure out what those gaps are day by day on shoestring budgets. And I think the hope of, or the task that I think we're giving the joint office is to hold that understanding of what we have, what we need and how we're going to do it, whether it's the joint office leading or the joint office stepping in to support other partners in doing that. And getting that narrative kind of like moving from whose job is it to fix this problem to how are we all working to strengthen our community? And I think there's a lot of power in seeing that happening together, not just seeing that Deschutes County is a service provider and one of them, you know, doing some of the most important work that the community needs. And that doesn't mean it's their sole responsibility to meet the need of every single person living outside, because they simply can't. So let's stop looking at the blame game and more thinking about working together. So that's something that came up early. And I think that's also where the ideas around the joint office really started to coalesce, is around that need. Elaine, and then, oh no, I'm sorry, Zavi, you go ahead, and then Elaine, and then Tara.
Thank you for that. And then just more like, I guess, wonderings, and just correct me if this is like not the time or place like for these, but I think for that education piece for services specifically, I'm thinking like Spanish speaking communities, do these services require, I assume they're going to require an application for them. Are they going to require social security and or like ITIN numbers for that, for those services or access those services? That's something that I've been hearing. And I think I believe it was Ashley's point of just like narratives, I think to like multi-generational homes, you know, I know a lot of families who have a lot of like grandparents, you know, parents, and then youth all in the same household. And that is also, I guess, a form of like houselessness, right? Or for like housing. Ashley's pointing to like herself. Yeah. So again, like again, a lot of families, that narrative again itself, I think it's not to say left out, but something again, I just wanted to kind of reiterate and just ensure that we're doing that. And I already see it on the partnerships with like landlords, and I'm thinking like property managements for all the property managements around the area for mobile homes specifically. But yeah, again, just more wonderings around like the access to these services and being that, having that be a part of the education piece. Yeah, for myself as well, because I'm not sure if they're going to need like again the social security and ITIN numbers like for those services.
Yeah, Colleen, if I can point to you, or maybe another service provider may be able to speak to the specific services that are available with and without social security numbers. Something I really appreciate you naming the need for communication to be clear and accessible to Spanish speaking community members. And something I put on a post-it here around topics that we want to make sure we're addressing and thinking about in public education is that across the country, and I think particularly on the West Coast and including the Pacific Northwest, Latinx housing instability and homelessness is nearly invisible because of multi-generational housing instability. It looks very, very different, much like homelessness in Alaska. Folks live 17 people to a 700 square foot apartment because they'll be damned if a member of their family is living outside or left to fend. And that speaks to really strong community and family connections at the cost of community support because of how we define homelessness, which is exclusionary. And so that's something that we've talked a lot about, working with the Latino Community Organization. I'm sorry, I think did I just get their name wrong?
Latino Community Association. I think you said it more or less. Yeah, you're good.
Oh, okay. And making sure that they are a key partner at the table to inform not just community engagement and public education, but also strategic priorities from here on out as well, to make sure that we're understanding what those nuances of challenges are and how we can make sure services are tailored to meet those needs. But I'm wondering if someone can speak specifically to the resources available with and without social security numbers, maybe documentation. Eliza, is that a volunteer hand?
And I think just to jump in real quick too, just ensuring that that is safe, at least also, like if they were to share those things, that it doesn't affect their status and whatever that is. Again, that's, I think that education piece ties into that, just to ensure, so on our end, at least for me too, like when and if I'm working with these communities, to ensure like, hey, like, you know, yeah, you're gonna have to put like, you know, your ITIN number or your social security, but it does not affect your status. It will not affect X, Y, and Z. It's not going to be shared across any other municipality. And again, to be able to ensure that as a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to note, like, as a service provider, like that provides shelter, we don't do a good job in this area, like really making it known to that community that they don't have to share social security numbers or have them or whatever, those documents to access shelter or services, JBRJ, just as an example, like that's not, information someone would know unless they tried to come in for services. So I think that's a really good point, and I'll be sure to make some changes about that. And I appreciate that point. And as far as like other housing options, like for support for apartments and things like that, I know that that's not on websites and that's not easily accessible information. So I think that should definitely be a broader, some planning around like how do we make resources known to people and have that be accessible. So I didn't really have an answer, just to say like, thank you for saying that.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that this be a part of the public education piece here as well. Under the last administration, federal administration, there was a lot of work that ICE did in order to make it not true that people's information is secure and safe. And that was done through intimidation, not by requirement of law. And so if there were food banks or shelters that were collecting that information, even though they didn't have to, it was possible for ICE to pressure them into sharing that information. And so that is how we got to communities saying we will not participate in working with ICE or collaborate with ICE. And so that's why I put this kind of as a policy implication, because it needs to be a political commitment on behalf of the community that will be protected, because we don't want to suggest that that we can ensure safety and protection through a provider alone. A nonprofit may not be able to navigate that alone, so we may need political commitment as well. So that's I wanted to share why I differentiated there. It was we saw folks in California no longer accessing food banks out of very reasonable concern that their status would be shared with ICE.
Thank you. One thing I'll note before, and I don't want to take up too much space, but you mentioned LCA, and you also mentioned you're from Seattle, so I don't know how familiar you are like with the area itself. But I think being mindful just to like LCA here locally, Latino Community Association gets tasked a lot for this specific community. And I think they do want to help, but I think the capacity may not be there always. And I would encourage like also working with maybe FAN, the Family Access Network within schools, and as well as like each school has a Latino liaison and or like the dual immersion programs and ELL, ELD teachers, because again, they work really closely with the students and with families and have a unique, and I think, I don't want to say better understanding, but again, they're trusted and they see them every day.
This is Stacy, and I was just going to add one more thing regarding reach. I think Eliza hit something that's really important. We are what I would call a welcome all agency, so we do not require any documentation, any social security. You don't even have to give us your name. You can be housed or unhoused. But what I'm realizing is we are not doing a very good job as an agency getting that information out. So I think that really that hits me, that we need to add that not only to our website, but to make sure that we're sending out an email to all the other agencies we collaborate with to make sure that they are helping us to let people know that we are a safe place. And then we also will get either assistance through another agency. So if someone's already got a great relationship with the LCA or with our veterans, it doesn't have to come directly from us. All we care about is that people are getting the support they need, whether it's helping with paperwork or essential items, whatever that may be. So this is great to talk about because it shows me that we have a gap that we need to, that can easily be filled in information for us. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, Stacy. I do not know the order in which hands popped up. I am going to trust my screen. Was it Ashley, Allison, Elaine? Or Elaine, have you been waiting a while? I'm not sure. You're on mute.
Thank you. I took my hand down, but not my mute off. Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief, but I have several points. So let's see if I remember them all. First of all, before I forget, on your list of standard partners, I would love to see healthcare particularly called out in there. And it's for our region, that's Mosaic and St. Charles that really take care of the houseless population. They may go to specialists and others, but I think we really need to call on our providers, medical providers who every day help the houseless population to also be in this conversation. And then kind of making sure we get that in there. We, as a nonprofit community service community health center entity, I just wanted to give us as an example of I don't know if you can see this. We do a community impact report every day. It's my background's making it weird. Every year, and we collect stories in the same vein that the city and the county are saying in the joint office, wanting to collect stories. So I just wanted to say there's power in us also collaborating and sharing our stories. And this one that we highlighted this year on Chris and Debbie was a wonderful story of collaboration, also to show the community how Deschutes County, Mosaic, Fuse, Reach, many others were helping this couple who were chronically homeless and find a stable housing and supports. So I just want to put that in, make sure we're using and collaborating on these stories and resources. I'm also on the board of Fuse, and just this conversation brings to mind how much we've talked about demonstrating the costs of specifically chronic homelessness. So I think we can do some sharing. Colleen Sinsky has done a lot around this, and we've talked a lot about it in the past couple of years of sharing already locally numbers. And if we could, again, all be using the same ones, wonderful. I also wanted to put out that for the last year, Mosaic has had, we put in place having a Latinx outreach Spanish communications coordinator. And just recently we've had a new person take the position, Jason Villanueva, who for the last 8 years has been a community health worker for us, actually working with the houseless population and many others. And I would love him to be a resource in this conversation because he's both very connected to the Latinx community and has been working as a community health worker for so many years. And so, it's FAN, it's LCA, but there's collectively pull together and be stronger together.
Absolutely. And the more I'm so excited to hear just lifting up the conversation, it already becoming a priority for folks, which shows just how powerful it is to convene the conversation and to have it. I am really glad we're focusing on Spanish language access resources for the Latinx community. I also want to lift up that we need to find some pathways to engage the Black and African American community representatives and community-based organization that's out there, as well as Native organizations. And these conversations, I've facilitated them both at the national level and at some local levels. Every time we have the conversation with a new community that it has been historically minoritized in our country, these points come up in different ways, be it language access, be it documentation status, protection from ICE. And ultimately, when we're revisiting our design or revisiting our priorities, it makes it more inclusive and accessible for everyone. And so as the joint office gets stood up, I think this will be a priority of having these specific representation-based focused conversations on historically marginalized communities in the region, to make sure that we're repeatedly revisiting what the priorities are and how they account for those needs and gaps. Thank you, Elaine, for all of those resources. If folks have access through Miro, feel free to put your own Post-its up or edit mine. I'm not precious about them. Allison, then Ashley, then Tara.
I think Ashley was ahead of me, so.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ashley.
Sorry, I can't see the Miro, but that is, I'm sure it's wonderful. But what I wanted to say was, Joshua, I believe, used the term discreet about some community organizations. I took away from his language there, at least my what I will build on is that some of those organizations can be at the root of some misinformation. Some of those organizations are very important to the activist community. I think that looking for the community leaders in those populations, I'm going to defer to like Joshua and Zavi to give their best suggestions. I'm going to go back to what my original hand was up for though. Donna Burklow from Family Kitchen has done an amazing job with storytelling. She needs to be involved if she can be. She's super busy and important in life, but she tackles really well the topic of just go get a job, which you hear in this community a lot because people visibly see it on reader boards everywhere. They're hiring at this amount. But in the topics of social security numbers, information about where you live, where do you get your mail, like all this kind of stuff, it's not easy. It's traumatic to try and get a job, and that job is not going to get you a house here. So walking through that process, I really think would be eye-opening for people. And Donna's a really good person and has done that. So for that being a topic or a focus for the Just Get a Job. And then I wanted to mention, we have a member on the committee, the Community Engagement Committee for the HLC, who's been on HLC, I think, since its inception, maybe Morgan. Buffy Hurtado, she's up in Warm Springs, and I'm sure she'd be happy to participate in her capacity already if she can. I don't want to speak for her, but I think she'd probably be the identified person from HLC at least. I think those were my notes. And it sounds like there's a lot of curating. I come from the art world historically, but it sounds like there's a lot of curating to be done here. Like we don't have to go out and reinvent any wheels. The stories are there, the stats are there. It's a matter of getting the organization there.
Yeah, I think the organization and the partners, it feels like there's a lot of energy underway and existing an interest in public education. It feels like it all needs to be a bit more comprehensive, tied together, and a broader view. How do we bring the partners that are interested in leading this conversation? How do we make sure that the community knows that the business community is interested, is prioritizing? What does it look like to really take this on as a community-wide campaign and effort? So I think we'll keep building there. Allison, Tara, and then Morgan.
Lower my hand. And maybe this is kind of already thought on the City of Bend visual narrative, but I think what's been super helpful for me to see too is just whether it's the point in time count, but like the number of our homeless population in comparison to the number of beds that we have available is like information that we all are using the same numbers from and are all kind of publicizing. I know the City of Bend has, goals for increasing shelter capacity and coordinating with Deschutes County to do that, but maybe that's something that like we kind of highlight as like a live count almost, that we're consistently using the same numbers on. That's just an idea of another point to share information on.
Thanks, Allison. Tara, happy belated birthday, friend.
Thank you. I didn't
this is a
find
publicly
you
broadcast meeting, so I won't have everybody sing to you, but go ahead.
I didn't find any new gray hairs this morning, so I'm feeling like that's a success, but 41's going good so far. This is such rich conversation, and I do apologize for going back to what I think it was Allison talked a little bit earlier about businesses losing revenue and like just really embracing some of the businesses. And I was thinking about potentially like the idea of how businesses can share and talk about the partnerships that they have specifically with a nonprofit and how successful it's been for them. Like I think I can put this on blast that I know Stacy and myself have had some pretty good conversations with Campfire Hotel, and that could potentially be like a really good opportunity for them to be like, oh yeah, I have this nonprofit on speed dial, and this nonprofit has offered to help train some of our staff. Because I think the reality is, sure, we're going to hear stories and that's going to get to people's hearts, but there's also going to be the reality of that story is not going to pay you can't give that story to Pacific Power. Like the business still has to survive. And the business still has to pay their employees, so they can't increase minimum wage if really it is about loss of revenue. So just putting like a business hat on for a moment, I think speaking to partnerships and collaboration that businesses have with nonprofits to speak about how successful it's been for them may be the same language for some individuals that, yes. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Again, I apologize for interrupting like this train of rich conversation, but I wanted to make sure to just kind of highlight what I think it was what Allison said.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. I really appreciate that perspective. Like, I'm snapping my fingers at that one.
I hope it's in a Z formation.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry, I've been watching In Living Color. I don't know.
You just aged yourself. So bad.
Okay, I'm gonna drive and go off camera again. But thank you. Thanks, Brittany.
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, Morgan. And then after this hand, we can totally jump in to actually be in conversation with each other too. It feels like a small enough group where we're having, synced conversation. So Morgan, jump on in. And
yeah, and I apologize. I'm not sure if this fits, but I'm really glad we're talking about stories and data that, hopefully will educate the community. I think a piece that has been missing is that, as various solutions are kind of talked about, we've left a lot of room for community members at large to imagine like worst case scenarios and put a lot of unfortunate language to their stereotyping of our unhoused neighbors. But I think if there's ways for us to kind of meet those assumptions head on and really paint a picture for folks of that future vision. Like if that's really our dream in 10 years, that chronic homelessness is not a thing in our community. That's a beautiful vision. And I think that's something that people at large would get behind, but we have a lot of, we want the solutions to happen elsewhere, out of sight, out of mind, or we want people just to somehow magically go away or get on their feet or figure it out. And so I think anything we can do to kind of normalize some of the solutions that we have in mind, even if that's not, hey, specifically this location with this model, but to say, hey, safe parking is going to be a thing in parking lots. And here's what a good safe parking program looks like, and tell stories about, the amazing work that Stacy has done. Or, hey, let's talk about community villages like Veterans Village, like St. Vincent's Place, like other places like that. Let's tell stories about permanent supportive housing and low barrier shelters. And let's talk about how this needs to be spread throughout the whole community, and that we're not just picking on one neighborhood or another, but to kind of give folks a long-term vision. Because I think as ideas come up, we saw this even with the county commissioners proposing those 11 acres east of town yesterday. There's even pushback for an 11-acre site 5 miles east of the UGB for Bend. And so I don't think there's a win necessarily right away, but if we can start to talk with each other about what those solutions could really be like and how they're not going to ruin people's lives and neighborhoods and communities, they're actually going to enhance them and improve the situation of our neighbors, these human beings who live among us, that there are dignifying options for them. I think painting that picture is a really important part of this.
And Morgan, if I can sort of feed off of that a little bit, and I apologize to the group too. I have to hop off for 30 minutes and then I'll come back. So I'll share this and then take off. But one thing you surfaced for me that I feel like is a part of this public education is helping folks understand what we cannot do. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest issues, right? Is when the city proposes a site for an outdoor shelter, like that helps give us more options, right? But we have community members come out and sort of oppose it. But what they're not realizing is if we don't provide more options for folks to go to safely live and have shelter, then there's not a lot that we can do to help what might be more aesthetic concerns that they have about seeing tents around town. Like, there's not much we can do to address that if we don't provide safe options for folks to live. And so there's this wonky legal jargon case history stuff that no one wants to talk about or no one knows about, quite honestly. Like when I see comments from community members, it's like, wow, if you only knew how limited we were to be able to address the concerns you're sharing, irrelevant of whether or not I think they are legitimate concerns personally. The reality is we have limitations, and folks need to understand that these solutions, like a camp even outside of city limits, you might not like it, but that's a way that we can help to address these other concerns that you have over here. And so I think there's an opportunity there to try to help educate the community that creating more safe places for people to live helps address what might be their more visceral aesthetic gut reactions to seeing folks living on the street. So I do feel like there's an opportunity there with the education piece to really help folks understand, like, we need these resources and opportunities. Otherwise, we can't even begin to address this thing over here that you're talking about.
Joshua, 100%. That's what I, said last night at the council meeting. We have to draw that line from, you're unhappy with what we have now, to how do we get to a better place? The only way to do that is to provide more shelter. And there's, like you said, there's some kind of disconnect there that people are just not making, going from point A to point B with that. And that's where I think we've tried to talk to a lot of our partners. We've talked to the business community about that. Like, we need you to help us draw that line. And there's still a lot of work to do.
Are we not raising hands anymore? I can just jump in there.
We're just jumping in.
Okay.
We're just jumping in.
I just wanted to say, having been like a service provider for, 13 years, I think sometimes I forget, and sometimes we forget in these kind of moments of like, how do we educate the community and or like public officials to really start at the basics. I've had a couple conversations about this recently, even with like officials, just about how like the reason people congregate in central locations is because they need to be closer to resources, just like all of us need to be close to resources, the lack of transportation. I mean, I think that sometimes we start at like a really high level of explaining social issues when maybe because they haven't lived it, they don't have lived experience, or really family who has had lived experience, then there's not really a way for them to understand the concept of people needing to be close to a grocery store because they don't have a vehicle. So just like wanting to just really focus on that, that if we are going to be educating people, we really need to like start at like a really low level of understanding to kind of try to promote empathy for other people. Because a lot of these people who are having issues are just really far removed from poverty and homelessness.
And also, Eliza, I think like acknowledging where we are in the process and that we're so far behind as a community, and we have all this catch-up work to do. And a lot of that catch-up work is just this public component, right? Of understanding what, houselessness is and, how it affects our community.
So I think we have a lot of topics. I really appreciate, Eliza, that back to basics orientation of needing to talk about the issue differently. I had someone raise the question earlier this week, are we talking about the new meth? And I don't know if folks are following the news, but meth has evolved. Meth has been evolving. It is more dangerous, more harmful, more addictive than ever. And I think an issue up here is both dispelling myths and acknowledging realities of substance use, economics, homelessness, capitalism, maybe not addressing capitalism so directly head on, but addressing the fact that substance use is not always a driver of homelessness, but sometimes a byproduct, and understanding that Oregon statewide needs better access to treatment and services for folks struggling with substance use. But the issue of homelessness is not solely a behavioral health issue, and it's an economics issue, and starting from the beginning with that story. I would love to take a step, and if folks need to take a break, we can take a quick one, maybe 15 minutes at 11 o'clock. We've been doing that for most of the action planning meetings, is taking a, oh, Colleen, we loved that view though. Feel free to come off video whenever you want. Sorry, the little ones just warm my heart. So we'll take a 15-minute break at 11. Two things I want to lift up. Maybe after the break, we can talk a bit more about what a broader public education campaign, a coordinated campaign could look like, what resources we could bring in, what planning for that might look like. But first, I want to lift up that we're talking a lot about people and not with people, both when it comes to community members who are really vehemently opposing the types of supports that the city is offering for people experiencing homelessness, but also people experiencing homelessness themselves. And I want to recognize that when you're experiencing homelessness, you're often in crisis, not particularly interested in this conversation or navigating those conversations. But I do wonder where there are community connections and interest in ensuring that people experiencing homelessness are a part of this conversation. It's not just our job to humanize them to other people, but to also give people experiencing homelessness a chance to engage with the rest of their community. Folks who are living out in the desert 3 miles out and have been pushed further and further out to the fringes of the community. I think their access points to this conversation, to helping people understand how they can support them, can be difficult. And nationwide, something we're learning is that our homelessness response is often very top down and looks kind of like screens like this, where I'm going to assume that all of us sleep with a roof over our head every night, wanting to do the best we can for others, but not necessarily creating pathways for them to tell us what that needs to look like. So in this public education and community engagement piece, I just want to ask if there are venues or structures or places where we know that people experiencing homelessness are coming into community conversations, where they are able to get engaged, or if not, how we'd want to build those pathways. So curious if folks have thoughts there, if there has been interest from folks with lived experience, either past or current, in supporting some of this organizing or getting engaged, or if that's something that we just need to start talking about across partners about how we can support that.
We just jumping in.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that's kind of, and I don't want to get in. Joshua just stepped off, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself with my director. And again, I just like my second month, almost my second month with the city. But something someone brought up was Dawn, right, from Dawn's Kitchen. And then I've been doing a lot of work with her and her organization, just building that relationship on my end, to be able to go there to understand, like, you know, when is she having, when are they having, you know, events or things where we can be in, you know, communication and contact with folks who are experiencing, you know, these initiatives that we're trying to, like, you know, solve or better. So I plan to do that, you know, as time goes on, for like relationship building pieces, again, for like myself and on behalf of the city, and just so I have an understanding. And one of those things happens on every Friday, like the lunch hour, and then Shepherd's House is also there. And I was able to serve some meals for Thanksgiving with Shepherd's House. So again, it's kind of building those kind of rapport, those relationships of like just showing up and just being there before kind of asking, is something that I'm really kind of leaning on, because I just, again, speaking for myself, me personally, I don't have a lot of relationships with those folks, let alone organizations, let alone people who are experiencing that. But that's kind of one way that I'm getting out there, I guess. And again, like my focus right now with like my work is like my assessment of like identifying or mitigating access to identifying barriers to services. But I can see myself playing maybe a role within this and within that, but again, I don't know if that's like going to be my role. But I just wanted to mention that, and I'd love for folks here to collaborate, like in going to that. Like we all go to Dawn's house on Fridays, or we're all, you know, just figuring out where folks are at to just talk to them. And I've seen the way, Shepherd's House and other organizations interact with, houseless, and they know them by first name basis, have conversations. And I think that's what I'm hearing her we're wanting and trying to do, to hear exactly from them or from the folks who are experiencing this.
And
I love it. I just wanted to mention Don's house and Donna Burklow are two different places. Donna's at Family Kitchen. Don's house is a women's home, I believe, for recovery.
Correct. Both are amazing, doing amazing stuff.
For both.
Yes, I just did a tour of Don's house, and I just met with Donna's kitchen.
And before I hop off, and I'm gonna try to listen by phone if I can, but I'm gonna hop off, and I wanted to mention two organizations, or one specifically that I work with that my business donates to. It's called Camp Companion Animal Medical Project. Yesterday, I'm out in the snow, and I see houseless members with their dogs, and those dogs have on booties and coats, and that is because of Camp. Camp works with veterinary organizations or veterinary offices, doctors, nurses. It's 100% volunteer run. So it's a lot of people that do veterinary work during the day. Joanna Weinberg Johnson is their founder. She has conversations and relationships with a lot of these people being the houseless community. Sorry, that wasn't the most soft language. But she knows, she's on a phone call and she goes when a puppy's hurt and she goes and picks that puppy up. So she knows what's going on in what is their home environment. Yeah. So there are people that are having those conversations and that are there by link, she's on the HLC. So it's a matter of getting them, if we need to be, that's surveys, that sounds clinical, but the people are out there. And some of those more discrete organizations that I referenced are out there too. I don't know how conducive to collaboration they might be, but they have conversations on a regular basis with these community members. So I'm gonna hop off. Brittany, I love you. I love your East Coast vibe. I lived out there for too long. And I was doing the more whoop whoop snap earlier. Yeah.
I love it. That works for me too. Thanks, Ashley. If you can't dial back in, email Mickey or I, and we will get you the dial-in info.
Yeah, and I'd love to circle back on how that our meeting on the 23rd can be conducive and helpful and not duplicitous.
Awesome.
Duplicative? I don't know what word I'm looking for.
Yeah, I mean, don't deceive them either. I really appreciate that. We talked, just to connect some threads to earlier conversations this week. We talked about the need for more support, it sounds like what Camp offers, building on some partnerships with the Humane Society and conversations that are underway there. So I put that sticky note up, recognizing that that's going to feed into some of the conversations that we had earlier about expanding services and addressing unsheltered homelessness. Folks need support in making sure their pets are safe and cared for as well. So that's awesome. And one thing, so I certainly, as we talk about engaging folks experiencing homelessness, I know there's, I definitely hear you, Zavi, that providers know folks on a first name basis and are doing their best to support them every single day. I think what I'm curious about is the degree to which folks experiencing homelessness have had access to this political conversation of what Bend is or what Central Oregon is becoming. I said Bend in particular because it's been such a contentious conversation with the city council. And I don't want to force people experiencing homelessness into some of the horrifying conversations and stereotypes, but I also don't want to, there's a word that I'm looking for, but I don't also want to, what is that word? Protect people who aren't asking necessarily to be protected from a reality of the community. So how do we make this public education conversation one that's also addressing head on that political ugliness and giving folks access to informing that conversation? What does it look like to say, no, your prejudices about me are inaccurate and unfair, and my story is not all that different from yours, except at this fork in the road, these are the choices I had to contend with, different from yours. And I don't want to force people into that, but I do wonder if there's interest. The time I spent at Shepherd's House, folks are more than happy to share their stories and be really candid, because that's healing. That's healing to any of us to tell the truth of our story to someone who doesn't quite understand it. Or in a space that it may not be understood, recognizing it also needs to be safe and considerate. So it's not a strategy I want to force anywhere, but I'm curious, before we take a break in a minute, anyone has thoughts there. I saw Michaela, you were nodding. I wasn't sure if you wanted to jump in or if that was just resonating.
Yeah, well, I'm going back and forth here because I know what Zavi was saying is really more like that relationship building, but its intent is to bring them into the political realm when we're having these hard conversations, right? But it's in the past, from lessons learned, when we first started talking about Juniper Ridge, we had staffers going out there and handing out flyers to the individuals that were living at those camps, and they're inviting them to these meetings, maybe even offering transportation. But how is it that we can ask that when these people are experiencing crisis? And I think we know that when you're worried about basic needs, you're not worried about the political conversation. And so I guess that's a part of the story that I think is important to tell too. And I say that because I had a conversation with a couple of folks, neighborhood folks from the Summit West neighborhood. Megan, you were a part of this. And what I heard from them was, well, there's some people living on the trails that we go and walk every day. And I offered to introduce them to our financial provider or advisor and see if we could get them back up on their feet. And they said that they weren't interested. And so therefore they don't want help. And it's like really just telling that story of like why that doesn't work, why we can't just thrust people into situations that I guess you guys know what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to go into depth, but yeah, those are just some thoughts that I've been circling.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, I was just going to say, I think that's like really a really good example of why it's important to ask our houseless neighbors what kind of services they need in our community before we, right, because we're creating shelter and services and allocating money before asking them what they need and what they want and where they're going to choose to get help. It's very similar. It's like a very similar way, right? If we bring them an option and we're like, well, this is your option, or this is what you can do, or nothing. It's very much the same as like offering them a financial advisor.
Yeah. Well, putting your lens right on,
right
on them, right?
Right. And
why wouldn't you want a financial advisor?
Right. So, and just like understanding that we need all different types of services. I think a lot of times, like we want to have like, okay, well, let's put all the money towards this, and this is where this is going to be the solution. And really, that's not how it works for a community. And it's not how it works for people. There's not one solution that works for everyone. And we really need to get input from them about what they need. So maybe not like, obviously we need to offer for people to be in different settings to educate people, but also understanding that it's not their job to educate us, just like it's not a person of color's job to educate us on racism. It's not their job to educate us on houselessness. I tried to, like, as being I was homeless. I share this openly with people. I was homeless for a long time. So I try to use my experience, but also understanding like we do need to get input from them about what they need, what they want to see, where our energy should go, and not decide those things for them.
Yeah. Thanks, Eliza. I promised a 15-minute break, so I do want to give it, if anyone has anything they wanted to share but won't be able to come back in 15 minutes, I want to create space for you to jump in now. Okay. I'll see folks back here at 11:20. Thank you all. All righty, we'll get ready to get started again. I'm just checking our participants, making sure nobody's in the waiting room. Okay. Okay. Hey there, Eric. Did I just lose Eric? Oh no, there you are. Okay. Our whole screen was reorganizing. Eric, at the top of the call, we did some introductions. Well, we did introductions as folks joined. So if you want to share your name, pronouns, where you work, and why you're here today, and then we'll jump back into the conversation.
Sure. Sorry for joining late. I had other meetings, but I'm Eric Kropp with Deschutes County. I work as a Deputy County Administrator. So thank you very much.
Great. So glad you're here. And I see that Commissioner Chang was able to join us as well, which is wonderful. Commissioner Chang, if you're in a place where you want to come off mute, introduce yourself or offering pronouns, where you work and why you're here today. We did some introductions as we started, and we just took a 15-minute break. We're diving back in.
Hey, everyone. Sorry I could not join earlier, but excited to catch the tail end of this conversation, and really excited to take a look at everything that's on this virtual whiteboard.
Yeah, we've had a great conversation so far. We have about an hour left, and I think where we left off, we talked a lot in the first half of the meeting around topics that we'd want to cover in public education campaigns, understanding where different partners in the community are in developing initiatives and resources around public education and information sharing. So those are the yellow stickies that you see up. The turquoise ones are around topics that we want to make sure we address. Some things that we went pretty deep on were ensuring access to Spanish language speakers, both for services and public education materials, making homeless services more accessible to folks who are Latinx and also folks who are concerned about privacy and information sharing and government surveillance issues that came up in the prior administration that we'd want to make sure may have some policy implications before we make any commitments to addressing those security concerns. And where we had some conversations as well around the business community's interest in supporting resources for homeless services and supporting some of these community engagement and public education efforts. And where we wrapped up and where I'd love to pick up is the importance of, before we get too deep into broader community engagement, making sure that we have input from people experiencing homelessness on what types of services they want to see more of in the community, what they'd like to see available and what they want and need. So I'm curious if HLC or other partners, what work may be underway there, or what work we may want to task the joint office with undertaking to ensure that that these strategies are aligned and that we're prioritizing and incorporating their stated needs into this work as well. So are there efforts underway to ensure that we're gauging what unmet needs there are, or what services folks would like to see more of? Either HLC, the city, the county. Folks, we've done away with our raise hand function since we're a small group today, so feel free to jump on into the conversation.
I just wanted to briefly say, so JBRJ, we did receive a planning grant to do just that. And so we have started kind of the initial gaps analysis that will focus specifically on homeless youth in the region and the needs that they have, that they identify, the resources that they need more of, and how JBRJ should grow in the future. And so over the next several months, we'll be surveying community partners, and then more importantly, youth who are experiencing homelessness or have experienced homelessness, and use that information to then do some focus groups and really grow using their input.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And I know some of our conversations earlier in the week have certainly been informed by providers' understanding of what people experiencing homelessness are asking for. So I want to honor that and hold space for that. If there are, I think one example that comes to mind specifically speaking about shelter expansion is that absolutely more shelter is needed, but in order for folks to be open to shelter, we need to ensure that we're making sure their pets, partners, and possessions have accommodations as well, that a roof over someone's head is not the only thing that they're concerned about. And so in our expanding services and addressing unsheltered homelessness conversations, we talked about the need for storage facilities. We talked about the need for pet care. We talked about just ensuring that when we talk about low barrier shelter, it's also about addressing the barriers to coming into shelter that folks may have. Like, where do I put my stuff? Where do I put my stuff when I'm on my way to a job interview? For example, was one of the examples that came up. So I do want to make space to recognize that a lot of what we've gotten today is informed by providers who are hearing from folks every day. Are there other coordinated initiatives underway to make sure that we're regularly gauging the needs of people experiencing homelessness as they state them, or where they're interested in seeing more services?
I think one thing, again, to your question, Brittany, about HLC, I think we heard earlier about a lot of efforts that are happening with our community engagement committee, and really trying to, not only from those that are experiencing homelessness, but our business partners and neighborhood associations and things like that to really provide some of this education. I think another thing, it's always something that we could do better at. I know that there's been conversations on creating a lived experience committee as well. But through our coordinated entry system within the HLC, we do ask some of these questions and try to really engage those that are calling into that as a resource of what are your needs. And we just had a really robust conversation, I think earlier, Liza, correct me if I'm wrong, if it was this week, last week, they all blur together, but about how do we ask and how do we engage those that are experiencing homelessness and seeking services what they want instead of prescribing that for them just because they meet the threshold of a certain program or housing option. It might not be what they want. And so we need to take that into consideration as well. And I think that if we are able to do that, that will better help us connect people to appropriate resources and address some of our system performance measures on exits back to homelessness as well. So efforts underway, they could always be more robust.
Yeah. And how could the joint office support those efforts? What could that look like? Either ideally from your perspective or just kind of folks brainstorming ideas of what the joint office could take on here.
I would like to propose that we have a advisory committee of people who are experiencing homelessness and pay them to advise us on these things. JBRJ does that. It's a requirement of our grants, and we've done it for years and years, really since we started our shelters, having a youth advisory committee that advises us on what the programs should look like, what the rules should be or lack of rules should be, how growth will happen. And so we've talked as the HLC board as well as having a youth advisory board under the HLC, which hopefully will happen very soon. But I think that if the joint office does come to be, I think that would be really key in getting input from people. And then that way, when there are questions, you bring that to the board, to the committee, to ask them what they think about certain things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. And would we envision an advisory committee to the joint office as being complementary to a lived experience committee of the HLC? Do you see space for those to be complementary rather than duplicative?
I think that would be great to, that's what we kind of talked about at the HLC level, that if we are going to have a youth advisory board, that it makes sense. It's the same board or the committee. We used it the same one for HLC as we do for JBRJ, and really make it kind of open to anyone with lived experience, any youth with lived experience across the region, making sure we have, equitable, that there are different people on that board there or on that committee, that it's not just a few youth from J-Bar J, that it's youth from Madras and youth from Prineville and youth who are Spanish speaking and those who are not, that it really represents our community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Folks have other thoughts on, I love this idea. And we had talked yesterday a bit about the joint office governing structure, whether, who the director reports to, who guides decisions, but also where there's space for advisory boards. And I think that this is really helpful. Yesterday, we were talking about what it looks like for providers, what are the providers' roles in advising the joint office. And I think this is kind of a parallel, if not integrated framework for us to think about too. Great. Okay. I am going to move us back to public education. So that was a bit in the community engagement realm. But with our last hour here today, I would love to get more specific about public education and planning. There are, as I mentioned, those 5 stickies across the yellow stickies across the public education piece that you see there are initiatives underway. And what I've heard is that we need a more coordinated community-wide public education initiative that is maybe more far-reaching than the 5 initiatives that we have carved out here. And I know that we've talked a little bit about business partners' interest. The interest of faith-based organizations and churches has been present throughout this week's conversations. I'm wondering if there are ways to leverage that community interest into a broader shared public education campaign. Communities have undertaken campaigns like this before. LA undertook a campaign that was specific to them raising revenue for permanent supportive housing development. I believe that was the We Are Home campaign. King County did the same as they were standing up the regional authority. I think it was a little bit more focused on public support for the regional office than it was around strategies to address homelessness. And I think that's a strength of the focus that I'm seeing in Central Oregon, is that it really not be focused on any particular initiative or any particular structure, but more education around homelessness as an issue. In prior conversations this week, we've also talked about the need for more media engagement and potentially training on reporting on these issues. So we're talking about reaching a lot of different pieces of the community. And I wonder if there's interest in leveraging either the work already underway with the visual narrative, with COIC and the Health Council and HLC, to feed these efforts up into a coordinated, broad community campaign that might also lean a bit more heavier on political support and reaching neighborhood groups and reaching broader sections of the community than folks that may already be signed up for our listservs and nonprofit, support and things like that. I'm curious if folks have ideas there. Go ahead, Morgan. Thank you.
This is just a side note, probably leading into this conversation, but I think it would serve us well as we're thinking about the larger community education and public education. Certainly there are large cities and counties that are doing some really cool work, but I think the less we refer to that, the better in terms of community buy-in. I've heard a lot of pushback when people are saying, hey, we don't want this to be like fill in the blank. And we're not, and Central Oregon is different, and Bend and Deschutes County are different. We have our own particular issues, and I think we can learn a lot from other communities doing good work. But I think if we stay away from citing those examples, that'll take us pretty far.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi. Hello?
Yeah, I think Commissioner Cheng was just going to jump in, and then we'll turn to you, Mickey.
I wanted to say that those examples that you gave, Brittany, I think were useful from the perspective of, people did public education campaigns with a specific goal. There was that first example. We do this public education with the goal of creating a new funding mechanism. The need I really see, as we're looking around right now, is acceptance of siting of facilities. I mean, we've just got this this dynamic happening where someone proposes an outdoor shelter or something in the community, and then the neighbors beat that down, and then we go to the next spot and we talk about that, and the neighbors beat that down. At some point, rather than having the community, the public engage in these deliberations on a like neighborhood by neighborhood NIMBY basis, we need to maybe engage all those neighborhood associations and say, okay, we have not heard any of you say that there's not a need for this facility. You mostly just say this isn't the right place for it, right? So so to go back to the examples of campaigns with a specific goal in mind, before we get to talking about what's our permanent funding source for these kinds of initiatives, we need I think we need to have a really serious community discussion about people agree that we need these kinds of facilities. How do we cite them in a way that does not feel discriminatory, essentially, like east side west side dynamic or other kinds of lower income higher income neighborhood dynamic. How do we do this in a way that doesn't seem discriminatory, but also just doesn't kind of leave us to the whims of NIMBYism all over the community?
I guess my follow-up to that, Phil, is how do we do that? How do we have that community conversation? And that's what I bang my head.
Yeah, no, I'm just, if we're looking for a theme or a goal for a campaign, I just wanted to put that forward. And then if we agree that that's strategically the right kind of campaign we need right now, then we can figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
No, I don't want to, I don't know. I don't want to be pessimistic in any sense. But that's one of the things that I really don't know if any amount of messaging is going to help us get more community buy-in. And I say that from working with the neighborhood associations on all of these issues and trying to understand where they're coming from for the most part of why do you not want this here? I see them grabbing onto things like we live in Central Oregon and so therefore camping is not shelter and they deserve better. And they try to flip it in this way that is not, I guess it makes them sound less NIMBY, but we all know what the underlying cause is. I think too, the things that I do know that they want, and I know, this is kind of contrary to what Morgan was saying, is they see LA and San Francisco and Seattle and Portland, and they want to know why Bend is doing some of the same programs and looking at some of the same approaches as those areas when they're so overrun with houselessness. And that really gets down to the root cause of needing to message why homelessness, why does this exist? I also see them, really concerned about good neighbor agreements, and that's with service providers. So in public education, they want to know, what good we get promised good neighbor agreements. What comes out of those? Who enforces those? What's the toll on our, if PD does respond to those, how is that engaged? So these are all just questions that I've heard coming out of the neighborhoods, and I'm not saying that I have answers for them at all, and I'm sure that many of you have heard some of these same things. I guess I just want to put it out there that I don't know if just saying Central Oregon's unique in the approaches that we're taking is going to be enough. I think they're going to want to see the data, the programs that have been successful in other areas, why we're looking at those that seem to help in land use issues.
Can I jump in?
Of course, yeah.
So this is reminiscent to me of 5-6 years ago, we were having the same conversation about when we started really looking at the need for permanent supportive housing. And one of the people that we engaged was Kenny LaPointe, who worked for Neighbor Impact and then Housing Works for a long time, and had moved to the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department as the public relations manager, specialist, something like that. And he said from the very, very beginning, you need to get ahead of the public education perception. And we didn't have a plan, and we didn't, we were still just trying to even understand what permanent supportive housing was, that we don't really have in the region. So I put that out there as Oregon Housing and Community Services have been dialoguing with communities for a long time on this issue, public education. Housing Works has the same thing going on every time they put affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And they have always, and we've partnered with them a number of times. So now I've really gotten it that they try to get ahead, and they know how to do this. So it seems daunting, but I think we have even local resources, even when we're talking about Cleveland Commons. Housing Works has said, we're not perfect, but we've done this type of thing before. And so they have said that they will, this is on their plan. So I would just put that out there. The Health Council, also being a member of the Stable Housing and Supports Group, has money, to engage a firm to help us with this, a marketing firm. So not that, it would have to be an application and it would have to come from the group, but I think we have resources that we could engage. And this has come up in that group also.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about where the region was 6 years ago. And just to put it on public record, I think I've said this to the task force before, I do think that Central Oregon still has an opportunity to not see the levels of crisis that other cities and communities in the West Coast are facing. And I want to be really clear about that the tremendous pace of growth in Central Oregon is still an advantage. It's not too far behind to catch up. The differentiator will be the availability of affordable housing and wages that can keep up with middle income housing as well. So it's the affordability of the region needs to keep up. That did not happen in San Francisco, then it did not happen in LA, and it did not happen in Seattle as the growth took off with economic growth at the high end of the spectrum. And affordable development did not keep on par. And that's, I think, part of where we go back to yesterday's conversation around affordable housing, is that the community needs to get really clear that it needs more deeply affordable housing, and it needs to put all of its tools that it can against that affordability issue at all ranges, but making sure that 0 to 30% AMI is covered in the next 10 years, that development keeps pace with higher end development. I'm sorry, Commissioner Chang, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, no, that was all really good discussion. So I just wanted to circle back when Megan asked the question, how do we do that? How do we work things out with these neighborhood associations? I have a lot of professional history in consensus building and alternative dispute resolution. And one of the ways to get people to the point where they can make hard decisions is to have them build the criteria for the decision outside of a process where they're talking about their personal interests. So I mean, basically, if we could get the neighborhood associations to get around the table and say, we agree that we need this, we agree, we understand the function of shelter, various kinds and transitional housing. But we have concerns about where you would place that. Then if we can do that in the abstract, tell us about your concerns. Let's try and translate anything that's not just like a personal, selfish interest into a criteria for making a decision. Then we end up with a set of criteria for making decisions about siting that they contributed to. And that then when they see it applied, they really might not like the outcomes, but we can just point back to it and say, hey, the neighborhood associations gave us all this input for, criteria for making these decisions, and we're using that criteria now. And so, the decision that comes out of it, if your neighborhood association wants to, hate on us for this decision, I'm going to just point right back to that criteria and say, like, you were there when we talked about how we balance all of these concerns and came up with these criteria.
I love that. And I think that is such the key point here is we're dealing with these neighborhoods on a reactive basis. They're hearing about the information and they're reacting and they're creating these narratives in their head that may or may not be true. And they don't feel engaged in the process of planning. And so if there's a way that we can begin to engage them, maybe there's a way that we can get to that point of consensus building. I think my understanding to this point has been that regardless of the surveys that we put out there and the input that we ask, we've had to limit them into certain criteria because of the way that they typically respond, knowing and I don't mean to put them all in this this one group, because I know we have some really great ones out there that are on board with all of this planning, but yeah, they feel like when they're being asked, they're not being heard. And sometimes that is what, being heard means we're doing things they don't agree with, not necessarily that they're not being heard. So I just want to make sure that if we included them in criteria and decision making, or criteria making at least, or something similar, that they would have the expectations of what the outcome would be clear.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Michaela. And then I'll turn to Morgan and then Josh. One thing I just want to throw out there is that's such an important point. Commissioner Cheng, you put like words to an amorphous idea that I had in floating around as well. And Michaela, I think you're surfacing some of the concerns and the reasons I hadn't vocalized them, that criteria needs to be informed by the needs of the community as we already understand it. And I think there's been a bit of a cart horse of, does the land that's available dictate what kind of services are accessible on it? How many folks can live there? What safety and security concerns look like? So I wonder if the criteria development process, that engagement has a starting point, but service providers, people experiencing homelessness, the city, the county can inform of here's what we need out of a space. And offering that to neighborhood associations as far as, okay, and what are the criteria inside that? Like, to your point, Michaela, folks not feeling heard because what they're being heard on are maybe not exactly where their influence can sway the decision. Josh and Morgan and Councillor Perkins, I know you wanted to jump in too.
Can I just before, just really quickly about that? I mean, that's kind of what we did with our outdoor shelter RFP. Is we said, to the service providers, you tell us what you need to make an outdoor shelter happen. And we sort of switched the process around that way. And what you need out of the land, what you need out of the location. Just wanted to kind of slip that in.
Thank you.
So Brittany, I think you voiced the question or concern I had, but much nicer than I would have, which was if we allow the community groups to be part of criteria setting, are we severely limiting the options, right? Because the criteria, to what I think both you shared and Councillor Perkins shared, like there are specific needs and functionalities that a site need to have. And so in allowing the community to set criteria, will that severely limit the options we have available in a landscape where we already have so many few options? So just a question to pose, so that as we go through that process, we're being sensitive to that we're not completely like limiting our opportunities by creating criteria, community-based criteria or community-generated criteria that are so restrictive that then we don't have places to site shelters and housing. Kind of along those lines, and my apologies, I had to step out for a meeting, so I missed a lot of the discussion around community engagement. One of the things that may help with that, and it's the kind of issues that we run in at the city level as well, is having a mechanism for folks to point their issues, questions, concerns, complaints around these facilities and sites. So maybe they don't get to decide the criteria. Okay, but we'll give you an opportunity to share and voice your concerns about that site when it's established and operational, and there will be responses to your concerns, those sorts of things. And I think of that too in terms in current state where folks, see camping in rights of way and have issues or concerns, or feel like, well, I need to complain about this to someone. Who do I send that complaint to? It's not really clear a lot of times. And so I think there's a piece of community engagement that acknowledges there are folks in our community that will just have issues around the unhoused community topic, and they need a place to point those issues, frustrations, concerns. Whether or not we can respond to them and how we're able to respond to them, I think is another question, but being able to provide that avenue for folks to sort of be able to share that frustration. I think I've learned that in a lot of this work is sometimes people just need to be able to vent, and then you can have a rational conversation about here's why we do what we do and why we can and can't do the things you're asking or you're wanting. But there's something about being able to have a singular point of contact with consistent information that's able to respond to community concerns. And so if we can add that to the community engagement, that might help just with the community engagement piece. But then as we talk about criteria for citing housing and shelter, maybe that's an alternative to letting community be involved with establishing criteria, is making sure that there's a very robust opportunity for them to surface concerns around some of those sites.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Joshua. And just tagging on to that, I think, Michaela, thank you so much for all the work you do with our NAs and NLA. As someone who's part of that, that group, I want us to remember that oftentimes the voices that we hear the loudest are not the majority voices, and not necessarily representative voices. I know that NAs are even now being invited into more work around thinking through, do they really represent their whole neighborhood? How do they invite voices from their whole community to the table? Because I think there's been issues of accessibility and inclusion there, for a long time, that have lots of factors to them. But, even as we're talking about how to engage the community, I just know that the people with the strongest reactions sometimes are usually folks against something, and are usually not actually in the majority in this case, and that there will be some folks that just you can't please, and that's a bummer. They probably won't come along and play with all of us. Being that First Pres is next door to one of the sites proposed by the city, I was kind of inadvertently involved in some of those conversations, and even with some neighbors where I said, if we were housing, because we're near schools, if we were housing, unhoused kids with their puppies, would you have an issue with that? And this person was like, yeah, I would have, so no matter what, no matter how we package it, sometimes people are going to be against it. But I want to make sure that we're mindful of those whose voices don't make it to the table, and those who don't have the capacity to engage in these kind of complex processes we're setting up. Some of our most vulnerable and underrepresented communities are needing the support. And so, yeah, I just really appreciate what you had to say, Joshua, about maybe not letting those forums for community input that might not be the most inclusive guide us in those considerations.
I was going to say, one approach is we can learn from the school districts, and whenever the school district needs to change school boundaries, that's very, very contentious. So setting up a committee of volunteers, developing criteria, and then having them go through the, identify what the project is and the available properties, and then allowing that volunteer group to hear from the community and the direct input from the community, even hearings, and then having that volunteer committee make a recommendation is one approach.
That's helpful. Thank you. So it feels like we're coalescing around this criteria and input process, specifically around citing. I wonder, do we feel like this is something that's similarly applicable to citing beyond camps? But is this something that's applicable when we're talking about finding locations for shelter and PSH? Different types of criteria, but would it be a similar process, or is this something that we kind of want to roll out with camping and see if it helps us create more inroads for citing other types of homeless service projects?
When Elaine was talking about the experience that Housing Works and entities like that have with citing affordable housing, I think that for permanent supportive housing, maybe there's some crossover in experience, but when we're talking about shelter, or we're talking about outdoor shelter, I basically in the political climate that we live in now, there is so much hate, and there is so much cultivation of hate. And what we have seen around the issue of homelessness is that this is a there are a lot of people who find this a fabulous place to deposit a whole lot of hate, and so this is looking at how contentious some other things are, like school boundaries or citing affordable housing. The degree of hate and discrimination that we have to contend with in this arena is, I think it's really beyond. It's beyond what we would find in some of those other citing kind of discussions, and so that all just goes to say I think this is a very special kind of problem, which it will need extraordinary kinds of public outreach and engagement to get ahead of.
Yeah, I really, I just want to name that it is about power, and it is about abuse of power, that people with homes see people experiencing homelessness as the most powerless in their community to express hate and pain that is actually originating in that person's experience from somewhere else. And that is why this approach to community engagement is so important, because folks do want to feel heard, because they are experiencing pain, they are experiencing pressure, and the ways that that comes out is an abuse of their positionality in the community. And I so appreciate the risks and the political will that has been built in Central Oregon against that. And I feel and see so much of the tension that comes up, particularly in these neighborhood and citing conversations. But I also, can't overlook the fact that this is connected to what Bell Hooks spent her life teaching us about love being the only way to get to justice. And that also means recognizing that folks are coming and abusing power out of a place of pain. And so strengthening Central Oregon has to do with strengthening the entire community and community connections across the board. And I think a process, though it may sound wonky to folks who haven't been in this or folks outside this conversation, setting up a process for folks to be heard through criteria and meaningfully engage in the conversation also builds community connection here. And I think that'll be really powerful in this process. And I apologize for going on a bit of an emotional rant there, but I really do see the connections to power and powerlessness playing out in such a painful way. But I also applaud that while folks against these initiatives may be louder, that folks in elected positions are making sure that the power is used responsibly and to support all members of the community. And so that kind of all brings me back to this public education and larger campaign conversation. And I'm curious whether, as we get the actions underway regarding criteria, regarding policy making, and we look at the public education campaigns that we have mapped out here, do we feel like that's enough? Do we want to create space for something broader? I don't want to pressure anyone into a broader campaign or a campaign that builds rather than goes across. I see that, the Health Council with funding for public education, COIC's interest, HLC's work, Mosaic Medical's work, it just feels like that can all be brought together. And then to bring in business partners, faith-based leaders, other healthcare providers, other community-based organizations for a coordinated community initiative. And I think that also brings me back to this question around businesses are interested in investing resources. Where does that go? I think this campaign could maybe hold some of those answers, not necessarily funding the campaign, but generating public support for funding X, Y, and Z. I'm not sure what X, Y, and Z would be. But I'm curious, is there an interest in either tasking the joint office or before the joint office has even stood up, bringing together a broad table to get a larger public campaign underway or a shared public campaign? I'm seeing a big nod.
I say yes.
So Brittany, I think that would be a great first project of the joint office. It's a way to introduce themselves and also to make a big impact in our community out of the gate and to let the joint office start taking ownership of that conversation.
And I think sharing ownership of the conversation, right? Giving the backbone to run it, because HLC is on a volunteer basis. People are providing services every day and then coming to HLC meetings. I think the joint office showing we're here to give that support backbone to folks who are already doing this and folks who are already understanding these issues deeply, but that we need someone to be able to hold space for new partners to come in, like the business community, like faith partners that, maybe they're involved in different pieces, but bringing them into a broader community conversation.
Yeah, Brittany, I really appreciate you just highlighting that I think it's really important for the success of this venture that we follow the lead of our service providers and we follow the lead of our neighbors who are actually experiencing houselessness. We have so many folks who have been doing this work for so long that I really want to make sure we continue to honor that and just bring them the support and accompaniment to kind of create space for them to do that even more successfully and remove some of the roadblocks and barriers that maybe they identify to getting the work done that they dream of. I really hope that we'll continue to follow their lead.
Yeah, I was gonna jump in, and I apologize. I had to step away for a minute, so I apologize if this is duplicative of anything anybody said. But how I envision this joint office is really to augment the work that the service providers are doing, and selfishly from the HLC perspective of, I think I've said this in other sessions this week, but the community wants HLC to be X. We need to be, or they want us to be X. They need us to be Y, and we have mandates that are Z. And so part of that is really the education of what each entity is. And again, if the joint office can again augment some of that work, because it is being done, it's just that it's on the shoulders of very burnout and very stretched thin service providers in the capacity to do more, which lies at the hearts of a lot of people that I know that want to take this on to do the community education and campaign, just isn't a reality. And so I think it's a great opportunity for an office to really take the lead of that. But to Morgan's point, rely on the people that have been doing the work, but take what their voices are saying to a broader level, I think is the key piece.
In addition to the joint office and in addition, or maybe we could name some of the partners again, are there any community partners that we could see helping carry this forward that maybe maybe aren't on this call, or we know there's interest, but we're not sure how to tap into it, or we haven't tapped into it yet? Are there folks that we want to lift up, particularly on this community engagement and public education campaign idea?
I think Allie had to leave, but you know, I continually think about how much the core area is affected by, and the central district is affected by people experiencing houselessness, and businesses are. And it would be, I think, really great to have, there's a new core area board that has just been sort of put into motion. Have them involved, I think, in this would be really great. And that would really tie in some of the things about businesses losing revenue, but also the fact that a lot of our, shelters are in that area of town too.
I'm also wondering if Envision Bend could play any role in this. And I say that just knowing that they're trying to really, to Morgan's point, paint that picture of how Bend is going to look in 20 years. And I think that having affordable housing, obviously, and some of these solutions in action is a big part of that vision.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this is ongoing, but at least some years ago, the Advertising Federation, AdFed, they would adopt basically one nonprofit each year to do a campaign. They would, like a whole bunch of really talented marketing people would volunteer time pro bono to do a campaign for a local nonprofit. And, people who understand marketing, who do marketing every day for their job, they really have some valuable insights on how to tell stories and where to place stories and what format to put stories into and those kinds of things. And so I'm not sure if AdFed is still doing that every year, but if they are, that might be a place to look for some synergy.
Colleen?
I was just going to highlight, I think an important piece is, I know that this joint office is, City of Bend and Deschutes County led, but I think it's really important to see and hear the perspectives from each city within Deschutes County. So I see on there, you have city partners, but I think it's just each city within Deschutes County is so unique. And has different needs, and the people that are experiencing houselessness in each city looks different, and the needs look different, and the population looks different, the neighbors look different. And so I think it's just an important piece as we talk about this from a regional perspective of Deschutes County, that those voices are also lifted up. And so I don't know if like the chambers of commerce is an opportunity to tap into that too, without calling out, certain groups within each cities, just more of a broad representation.
Great. And I know there's interest from Visit Bend in supporting the kind of coordinated, shared community response as well. So I'm going to put them up here in addition to the Chambers of Commerce. My next question, and we can keep lifting up partners that we want to engage, because I think that'll be really important, to build a table where we can get folks on the same page and also contributing resources and even just information channels to a public education campaign. But something Allison brought up in the beginning of the conversation that I want to circle us back to too, is that there is interest in investing in homeless services, but folks don't know where to put their money. And as we get a campaign underway, I don't want it to be a self-serving one where we're trying to have, folks come to the table and they say, oh, I can help fund this. And we have a very well-funded campaign while we don't have service providers necessarily getting part of that. So I'm curious, Colleen or others, if there's an approach that the community's taken to that type of interest in the past, recognizing that there are several providers, or is that kind of funding pool something the joint office might be able to hold? Curious what thoughts are there as far as places to invest.
Yeah, that's been a really interesting topic of discussion, Brittany. I know from like the HLC perspective, because the more we become, or the HLC becomes known, as people refer to us like, oh, we'll go to the HLC. We aren't an entity. So we, even though we can accept donations and use those for things like the point in time count, because that is regional and touches many people, or other efforts like that. Years ago, I think it was like 6-7 years ago, the Bend, it was a livability group, I want to say, or it's part of downtown Bend. There was an initiative to accept donations, and they had certain agencies that it was to deter panhandling. And there were certain agencies that were selected, and the funds were funneled through that to certain agencies, and people could pick what agency they wanted to donate to. I personally don't like that approach because it doesn't encompass everybody. And again, thinking regionally in this kind of approach, it's hard to think of what that looks like. So how we've done that in the past is not it hasn't been successful. So I think if that was something that the joint office could help take on, because I also receive many calls all the time from people saying, I don't know who to contact to donate for this cause, or I don't know who to talk to that has this type of funding, or where the funding is going to. And so that's where I really see something hopefully that the joint office could help with, is mapping where funding is going and needed, where the gaps are. And if there was this kind of way or process with somebody in the community, private or community member wants to donate to the cause of homelessness, that there is a directable way to do that. But I also think that takes a lot of kind of coming back to the conversation of what Morgan said, is taking the lead of service providers that want to participate in that, because that was a discussion years ago with Visit Bend or the livability group, was for like, well, I don't really want to be associated with deterring panhandling. And so even though that may be something that we or service providers could agree on, the connection to that could be a negative association. So I think it's really important to take the voices in of service providers that are looking for funding. I mean, it would take a lot of mapping. And so again, something that the joint office could help with from capacity standpoint.
Yeah. I think where my brain is going is maybe a two-pronged funding pool, one that is directly for service providers, and maybe it's funding that's collected annually, quarterly, what have you, that's then divided among service providers in the community, but also funding that could directly stand up prevention and diversion resources that would be available through coordinated entry or at shelter intake. We've talked a lot about, and one of the milestones for the first 5 years is that prevention and diversion resources be available. nationwide, what we know is that it is much harder for someone's experience of homelessness to end once they are 6 weeks in than it would be to have supported them 6 days before they started experiencing homelessness. So I wonder if I don't want to put those two things at odds or in competition. And there is a program stand up that would be required around prevention and diversion. But I'm curious how that lands.
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion 2 years ago, I'm thinking now 3 or 4 years ago, about landlord mitigation funds. So that could be something that's a pool of funding for people that are getting housed through coordinated entry or other systems like that have a lot of arrears, meaning past rent, past utilities, or it's a landlord incentive to say, yeah, I'll rent to this person if you guarantee me this amount of a deposit or to cover damages when and if somebody exits and there are damages. So I think that is appealing to landlord, right? It can be cross-sector that way. But again, who holds that funding? And then who determines the amount per person or per household? Those are all details that I think get that are at the table and then kind of fall through the cracks, for lack of a better way to do that, because service provider capacity.
Absolutely. And that's a place where models from other communities could be helpful. I think Columbus has stood up a pretty strong diversion program, DC as well. And this is something that service providers can certainly inform. I know that there are prevention and diversion, two different words, resources available or used. I heard when we first started this process that the sheriff's office uses some of their fundraised dollars for needs on an ad hoc basis. If someone's car's broken down, if someone needs gas, if there are resources that they use, I would love to pull those into a coordinated approach. And maybe one where you don't have to engage with law enforcement in order to have access. It's great that they're doing that though. So there's certainly stuff to build on both locally and from around the country there. I'm curious, is that something as we're talking about folks getting interested in investing resources, would we want it to be focused on something like that? Or would we want to make it kind of a few different channels that folks might be able to invest in? And we don't have to decide that now. I just want to get some ideas on the table before we broaden the conversation to bring other partners in too to this campaign. I'm curious what maybe Eliza, from your perspective, or even Morgan, others, what fundraising looks like for nonprofits in the region, and whether that's coordinated, whether that's how much are folks relying on private philanthropy and working together on that?
I can speak specifically for one of the shelters that I run, Grandma's House, which is our only maternity group home for young people. Really, the closest one is Portland. I think there's one there, a really small organization there, that we rely on maybe 2/3 of our budget from the community and private donations, the small donations from churches. And that's really because there's not a whole lot of funds allocated to homeless youth services in the state or region. So I don't know. I think that because we really in our area, we really do need additional funding, that oftentimes there's different campaigns going on at the same time. And you kind of have to rely on okay, well, I'm, collecting donations for homeless youth. So I'm relying on the community, people that have a heart for that. Over if the BI is doing a campaign, if people have a heart for that population. So I do think that there's not a lot of coordinated effort as far as fundraising. And I like the idea of the mitigation funds or the prevention funds like a fundraiser for that could serve everyone. I think that's a huge need in our community. And just within coordinated entry, you know, Brittany, that coordinated entry can do a lot of preventative work. And like, really, that's kind of what it's geared toward. It's supposed to do that. We just haven't had the means to do that through coordinated entry in our region, just because of being small and volunteer ran. So I'd like to really see that be kind of connected to the navigation center. I keep throwing that out there because I'm like, come on, guys, we want a navigation center or a couple. So I really see that as like being a place where people can utilize those things, because, you know, it's not just for people experiencing homelessness, but people who are at risk. We really have to make it easier for people to know where the resources are. And that's really the purpose of coordinated entry. It's a big concept, but really it's that there's one place that people know where to go to get help. And they don't have to they don't go to one community provider and being told like, okay, this is the list of places to call or the list of places to go. It's really a one-stop shop so that they can get the support they need to avoid homelessness or to escape homelessness in a quick and effective way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Eliza's spot on. The flip side of that, as you asked about fundraising and like donations and resourcing, you know, from the larger community side, I've found that people have a lot of energy and goodwill to give, and often they don't know how to prioritize their giving or where to drop off that sleeping bag they found in the garage that they don't need anymore, you know. So it's the whole range. And so, you know, I know that the city did some work early in the pandemic, even with their mapping system of identifying places where people could access water or electrical outlets or public bathrooms or Wi-Fi. I know that there have been kind of piecemeal attempts at, you know, community organizations, including pandemic partners, to kind of map or have a website where people could figure out, you know, what food resources are available on a given day and where and how to access them. But it's really pretty scattered. And I think, you know, those kind of like volunteer community-led efforts have been really, really great. And that in the coordinating role of this joint office, even having, you know, easier on-ramps for people to be involved and not have to work so hard to utilize that goodwill and that desire to help. I think the easier we make that for people, in terms of volunteering, donating funds or donating supplies, you know, that'll be a really great way for us to engage with the community.
I just wanted to say, I do think that in our region, the providers do a really good job of like for example, if the Bethlehem Inn did a coat drive, I know as a provider for homeless youth that I can call the Bethlehem Inn and get coats from them. They'll share, and so does Kovo, and so does, you know, the county, we all kind of share with each other. So if we have a resource, it doesn't just go, if we have extra, or even if we don't, we make it work. And we do a lot of sharing and partnering, and I'm always telling our outreach team here at JBRJ who those, because those are long-standing partnerships. So I think our community is also super giving, like Morgan said, like they're incredibly giving, but I think having like a focus of who to give to and what to give, and because we do a good job of sharing, but I do think the communication could be better as far as like where to give to and what to give.
Yeah. Great. I'm gonna just put that on a sticky real quick. Put that over here. All right. We have brought up a lot of ideas today. This has been such a great conversation. We do have a few more minutes. I want to open it up broadly. We talked a lot about community engagement, public education. Are there ideas that folks wanted to bring into the conversation today, but you haven't had or found a space to yet? Untapped opportunities? ideas. Okay. Awesome. Michaela, one thing that came up, and I'm just thinking of this now, in yesterday's conversation around affordable housing actually was how the council recently tasked neighborhood associations with becoming more representative and thinking about what that looks like. And that feels like something that the joint office could support, but also just this community engagement process could support of helping neighborhood associations understand how to be more inclusive to neighbors, to service providers, to folks experiencing homelessness. So that's something that's kind of an action that's hanging out there for us to think about too, so that we may be in touch for more details there. Any other ideas, groups, organizations, partnerships? Yeah, Morgan.
Well, and I think that that resource even exists among many of our service providers, you know, who have been willing to share, you know, those ideas with neighbor associations or other groups who want to know better. Like, that's a dream request, right? Like, I would take time out of my personal life to show up and be like, hey, let's talk about the humanity and dignity of our neighbors. You know, if that was a request that that groups made, whether that's an NA board or an NA group or anybody else. I mean, I think we have those resources in our community. So that would be an area where I would double check that we're not duplicating resources or putting that task on the joint office when it already exists among so many really amazing humans in our community.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, something, oh, sorry, someone was going to jump in. Go ahead, Sally.
I was just going to mention what you mentioned there with like the neighborhoods. I think that's something, and Joshua, correct me if I'm incorrect on this too, of my assessment piece, once I finish it, will overlap a lot with Michaela's work for that specific reason. I think that's what Morgan's speaking to as well, to kind of broaden that representation at neighborhoods, and also understanding that, you know, like with like my constituents, you know, once my assessment is done, there, what I will find and what I kind of, you know, inherently kind of know will be that they engage in very different ways. And so being able to be creative within like that engagement piece, kind of what we were talking about earlier, in those approaches. One thing, and again, like, I don't know like where and how like my position specifically will grow within that, within like maybe this and or at large, but I also know like within the county, and I've been able to talk with Shanna, I was a DEI person there, and then they have a specific Latinx outreach person, but it's specific towards COVID only, from my understanding. So hopefully seeing that growth for that specific community, but then also just at large with Shanna's for DEI, for that broader representation and for these other kind of groups that we're trying to and wanting to like engage moving forward, whether it's, you know, community partners, and I think, you know, Brittany, you had mentioned, you know, African-American like folks as well as like fathers groups, like other things like that, to where it's like, right, like what does that look like for engagement, and not just tasking, I think, neighborhoods, right? Because I think someone mentioned too, it's very like kind of narrow focus as of now, as far as like representation, to figure out like what this like partnership levels look like. And separate to that note, on partnerships, I'm just curious if we want to include parks into this, parks district, in some way. And I don't know what that looks like, but I think pushing them in a positive way to contribute, I think, as a, you know, other municipality within our area would be positive.
Awesome, great. I'm seeing a lot of nods there. So purple posted it gets. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
And then Brittany, that's what I was going to say, kind of along the lines of what Zavi was sharing, is I think there's an opportunity, and this kind of goes back to your initial question, like what other gaps do we need to fill in, but just to kind of note that there's a lot of potential for information sharing. And I think particularly among public agencies around work that each of us is doing in these. So Zavi's example of the work that he's doing with underrepresented communities is great. Like, that's going to be very helpful information for us at the city. That's why we created that position. That's why we hired Zavi specifically to do the work. But obviously those insights will apply to a lot of outreach that we do, particularly for members of our unhoused community. And so, in as much as we can kind of build that into the culture and the bones of the joint office, I think that will be helpful to share our learnings and best practices so that we can all be more effective in this work.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. Josh, for that. I think that's reiterating some ideas around transparency that have come up throughout the conversations, clarity around information sharing, clarity around roles, responsibilities, what's actually happening. So I appreciate you naming that needs to be in the DNA of the joint office. Thank you all so much for your time today and your time throughout the week for these action planning meetings. So our next steps are that we are taking this giant board. I'm kind of scared to zoom out of it at this point, but I will show you we have ideas from across the week that have come up, and we'll be translating these into the actions that go beneath the strategies inside the strategic plan over the next month. Working on moving that forward. You will all have an opportunity to weigh in on fine-tuning all of that throughout the process. But thank you so much for all of the wisdom and ideas that you've shared, the time you've given to this process. I really hope we do it justice in the end, because there's just so much valuable information and commitment in the community that makes this work absolutely beautiful to do with you all. So thank you for the opportunity and for your time. I hope everybody has a great Thursday, happy holidays, and happy New Year to folks I won't be talking to until January. I hope you all get good rest.
Thanks,
Take
Brittany.
care. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, friends.